I never thought that dragging a dying, monstrous shadow panther out of a cursed forest would mean accidentally adopting the Empire's most terrifying, bloodthirsty warlord. Welcome back to your BL boyfriend. If you are obsessed with thrilling, plot-twisting, and heart-racing BL stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and drop a comment down below. Your support means the world and helps us bring you more epic tales. Now grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's dive right into the story. Part 1. The last thing I remember from my exhausting modern life was the sharp, clinical sting of antiseptic and the relentless, deafening beep of a flatlining heart monitor. My name was Julian. I was 32 years old, chronically single, and the head trauma surgeon at a major metropolitan hospital. I survived on black coffee, 3 hours of sleep, and the pure adrenaline of pulling people back from the brink of death. After a brutal 30-hour shift, I finally sat down at my desk to chart my notes, took a sip of my cold espresso, felt a sudden violent squeeze in my chest, and my vision tunneled into absolute blackness. Cardiac arrest from sheer exhaustion. A truly embarrassing, entirely preventable way to go. I didn't get to see a bright light. Instead, I woke up to the sensation of my internal organs being vigorously scrambled. I groaned, attempting to open my eyes, only to bite my tongue hard as my jaw snapped shut. I was inside a wooden carriage, bouncing violently over a dirt road that felt like it was paved with spite and boulders. "Where am I?" I croaked, my voice sounding entirely too thin and melodramatic. The carriage suddenly lurched to a halt. The wooden doors were thrown open, letting in a blast of freezing autumn air. Two men wearing heavy armor and the crest of a noble household stared at me with expressions of utter, unfiltered disgust. "Out!" One of them barked, pointing the sharp tip of his spear toward the muddy dirt. "We've reached the absolute border of the capital. This is where your exile begins, eldest young master." Eldest young master? Exile? I stumbled out of the carriage, my legs feeling like overcooked noodles, and hit the dirt. Suddenly, memories that absolutely weren't mine crashed into my brain like a collapsed bookshelf. I gasped, clutching my head as the life of Julian Thorne played out behind my eyes. Oh God, I wasn't just in some generic ancient era. I was inside the Crown's golden cage, a disgustingly melodramatic BL novel my surgical resident had forced me to read, and I hadn't transmigrated as the beloved male lead or a helpful side character. I was Julian Thorne, the cannon fodder, the villainous, despised, and ultimately abandoned older brother. The original Julian was the legitimate son of the powerful Duke Thorne, but after his biological mother died, his father remarried a two-faced stepmother with an illegitimate son, Cale. Cale was the novel's quintessential green tea protagonist, a master of the soft smile and perfectly timed tear who cultivated a flawless reputation as a kind-hearted saint. The final, fatal blow had happened yesterday when Cale's beloved, incredibly rare silver-winged falcon was found poisoned. Cale wept beautifully while the stepmother miraculously discovered the poison hidden beneath Julian's mattress. Duke Thorne didn't care about logic. He ordered his eldest son stripped of his noble title, brutally beaten, and permanently exiled. "Here is the deed to the Blackwood estate," the family guard sneered, tossing a parchment into the mud. "The Duke has wiped your name from the family registry. If you ever step foot in the capital again, your father gave us strict orders to break both of your legs." With that, they slammed the doors shut and rode off. I stayed on the ground for a long moment. The original Julian would have been weeping, screaming for his father, and tearing at his silk robes in despair over the cruel injustice. I just reached out, picked up the deed, dusted it off, and tucked it safely into my sleeve. A family betrayal? Please. I had survived hospital administrators who stole my department's budget. A toxic family cutting me off and handing me free real estate was the greatest blessing I could possibly ask for. I took a deep breath of the crisp, smog-free air. I had died of a heart attack at 32 because I couldn't stop working, and the universe had drop-kicked me into a fantasy novel, handing me an isolated estate far away from city politics and psychotic relatives. They called this exile. I called it early retirement. I turned around to face my new home. The Blackwood estate sat at the base of a foreboding pine forest. The stone walls were crumbling, the courtyard was overgrown with thorny weeds, and the main house looked like a dump. But to a modern millennial who could never afford property, it was a palace. "All right, Julian," I whispered to the ghost of the body's previous owner. "Your family was garbage. I'm taking over now. There will be no begging, no court drama, and definitely no manipulative stepbrothers." I spent the next 3 hours acting like a one-man demolition crew, hacking away at the weeds with a rusted sickle until my soft palms blistered. Physical labor was honest. It didn't frame you for poisoning a bird. By sunset, I had cleared a path and swept out a decade's worth of dust. I was starving and my back ached furiously, but I felt incredibly peaceful. The primary problem was that I had absolutely zero food and only 3 copper coins. If I was going to survive, I needed to forage. I grabbed a woven basket and headed toward the shadowed woods, a dense pine forest infamous for dangerous wild beasts. Perfect. Where there were no people, there were untouched resources. Using my medical knowledge of botany, I quickly found edible mushrooms, wild garlic, and bitter greens. I was reaching for pine nuts when I smelled it, the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. A lot of it. The instinct of a normal person would be to run back to safety, but I was a trauma surgeon. When I smelled blood, my feet moved toward it before my brain could argue. I crept forward and stepped into a small clearing, my breath catching painfully. Lying half-crushed beneath a fallen pine tree was the most massive animal I had ever seen. It was a panther the size of a fully grown draft horse, its pitch-black fur matted with dark, thick blood. Deep, jagged lacerations tore across its flank, radiating a sickly purple mist of poison or dark magic. Even half-dead, the creature exuded a suffocating pressure. As I stepped on a twig, its glowing, crimson-red eyes snapped open. A low, vibrating growl rumbled from its deep chest, bearing fangs long enough to puncture steel armor. It was a clear warning, but I just sighed. "Oh, stop being dramatic," I muttered. I had wrestled 300-pound patience. A giant, bleeding goth cat was just another Tuesday. I set my basket down and slowly walked toward it, keeping my hands visible. The panther's eyes widened in sheer shock. It tried to attack, but its front legs gave out, and it collapsed with a sharp whine. "Yeah, that's what I thought," I said calmly, kneeling beside its massive head. "You've got massive hemorrhaging, a crushed hind leg, and severe poisoning. If you bite me, you'll bleed out faster, so keep your teeth to yourself." The panther tracked my movements with intense, uncomfortably human intelligence, but didn't snap as I checked its erratic pulse. I needed to stop the bleeding immediately. I violently tore my expensive outer silk robe into long strips with my rusted sickle. "Hold still," I ordered, pressing the bundled silk against the deepest gash. The panther flinched, snapping its massive jaws inches from my face. I didn't blink. I glared right back into his glowing red eyes. I said, "Hold still. Do you think I want to be out here freezing? Behave." To my utter disbelief, the terrifying beast stopped. It looked profoundly offended, but let its heavy head drop to the moss. "Good boy," I murmured, applying heavy pressure. The bleeding slowed, but I needed to flush and stitch the wound. I managed to drag the fallen branch off its bruised hind leg. "Listen to me," I told the panther, patting its snout. "I'm going to run to my house for boiling water, a needle, thread, and strong alcohol. If you die while I'm gone, I will be very annoyed with you." It let out a faint huff that sounded like a scoff. I sprinted back to the ruined estate faster than I ever had, raided the kitchen for a thick needle, sturdy linen thread, and a sealed jar of highly potent grain alcohol, boiled water, and sprinted back to the woods. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, and the panther was still there, breathing shallowly. "This is going to hurt," I warned, uncorking the jar. I poured the harsh alcohol directly over the open wounds. The panther roared, an agonizing sound that shook the trees, but I threw my entire body weight over his chest to pin him down. "Stay with me," I yelled, threading the needle, my trembling hands steadied with absolute, ice-cold precision. This was my domain. The muscle memory of 1,000 surgeries guided my fingers as I flawlessly stitched the jagged flesh together. An hour later, drenched in cold sweat and shivering, I poured the remaining alcohol over the stitches and wrapped his midsection tightly with the rest of my torn silk robes. I sat back, exhausted. The panther was looking at me, its crimson eyes calm and filled with a heavy, evaluating weight that sent a shiver down my spine. "There," I breathed out. "You'll live, but you need to stay warm." With an 80-year-old man's groan, I heaved the massive beast to his feet. Leaning heavily against me, we hobbled through the dark forest, a disgraced young master and a giant shadow panther. When we finally reached the main hall, I collapsed onto the floor mats, threw a blanket over him, and provided water before falling back against a wooden pillar. "Congratulations," I muttered to the ceiling. Day 1 of family exile, and I already adopted a stray. Beside me, the giant panther rested his heavy chin on his paws, watching me with burning red eyes. What I didn't know was that I hadn't just saved a wild animal. I had just stitched up General Draven, the Empire's most terrifying warlord. And my greatest nightmare had just decided I was very, very interesting. End of part 1. Part 2. The next morning, I woke up to the suffocating sensation of something incredibly heavy, radiating furnace-like heat, and distinctly murderous breathing directly onto my face. I opened one eye. The giant, terrifying shadow panther was standing over me, his massive, scarred snout hovering mere inches from my nose. His glowing crimson eyes were narrowed into lethal slits, his thick black ears were pinned back against his skull, and his sharp claws were unsheathed, digging into the wooden floorboards on either side of my head. He looked like a creature crawled straight out of the abyss, ready to devour my soul for breakfast. I didn't even flinch. I had dealt with sleep-deprived chief of surgery residents who had significantly more intimidating morning breath. Personal space, I grumbled, raising a flat, uncalloused palm and casually pushing his heavy, lethal muzzle away from my face. Back up. You're a recovering patient, not my alarm clock. And frankly, it's too early for intimidation tactics. The giant panther froze. His crimson eyes widened a fraction, as if he was utterly, completely baffled that I hadn't immediately started screaming for mercy or wetting my trousers. He let out a low, rumbling warning growl, the kind of deep, vibrating sound that probably made enemy battalions drop their weapons and flee in terror. I merely yawned, stretching my sore arms over my head, my joints popping in loud protest. Save the tough guy act for someone who actually cares. I'm making breakfast. I staggered to my feet, ignoring the dumbfounded look on the apex predator's face, and headed straight to the dusty Dermcat kitchen. The chill of the morning air bit through my thin clothes, but my mind was already shifting into work mode. I managed to light a fire and boil the last of my foraged bitter greens and wild mushrooms into a watery, profoundly depressing mush. It smelled vaguely of damp earth and regret. When I brought the cracked ceramic bowl into the main hall and set it on the floor in front of him, the panther looked at the bowl, then slowly looked up at me. His expression clearly and eloquently communicated. "Are you insulting me? Eat it," I said, tapping the edge of the bowl with my foot. He turned his massive head away, radiating an aura of supreme, aristocratic disdain. "Oh, don't give me that attitude," I scolded, putting my hands on my hips, seamlessly sliding into my uncompromising doctor persona. "Do you think I'm holding out on you? Do you think there's a secret roasted chicken hidden in my sleeves? This is literally all we have. You lost nearly half your blood volume last night. You need nutrients to rebuild your cell tissue, and I refuse to die of starvation because my rescue cat is a picky eater." The beast's massive head snapped back toward me. Cat, if looks could kill, I would have been reduced to a pile of smoldering ashes right then and there. But his fierce glare was entirely undermined by the sudden, violent rumbling in his stomach. With a deeply humiliated sigh that sounded entirely too human, the giant panther lowered his head and began to lap up the watery mush, his ears twitching in absolute misery. I smiled, feeling a brief flash of professional satisfaction. "Good boy," I praised softly. Without thinking, I reached out and vigorously rubbed the thick, soft fur behind his ears, right at the base of his neck. The panther choked on his mush. He jerked back, his crimson eyes wide, his massive body going completely rigid. He stared at my hand like it was a cursed, highly explosive artifact. I frowned, dropping my hand. "What? Don't look at me like that. You're a feline, you're supposed to like ear scratches." To prove my point, I reached out again and scratched right under his strong jawline. The Empire's most terrifying warlord, currently trapped in a furry body, looked like his brain had completely short-circuited. He let out a strange, high-pitched whine, immediately realized how horribly undignified it sounded, snapped his jaw shut with a loud clack, and buried his face between his massive paws, refusing to look at me. I chuckled, entirely oblivious to the monumental existential crisis I had just caused the demon general. But ear scratches didn't pay the bills. If I wanted to survive and turn this ruined estate into a proper home, I needed capital. I checked his bandages, noting that the bleeding had completely stopped and there were no signs of infection, ordered him strictly to stay put, and walked down the mountain to the nearest settlement. It was a modest farming village called Oakhaven, far enough from the capital that the name Julian Thorne meant absolutely nothing to them. I wandered the dirt roads, ignoring the strange looks the villagers gave my torn, blood-stained silk robes, until I heard loud shouting near the local mill. A large crowd had gathered around a weeping merchant. In the center of the square, a massive iron-hide ox, a prized beast of burden the size of a small tank, was thrashing wildly on the ground. Its abdomen was grotesquely swollen, stretching the thick skin tight like a drum, and its eyes were rolling back in its head as it gasped for air. "It's a curse," one of the villagers yelled, backing away. "The beast is possessed by a demon." The local village friar was standing far back, shaking his staff. "It's too far gone. Put it out of its misery before it destroys the mill." I pushed my way through the panicked crowd. "It's not a curse," I said loudly, my voice cutting cleanly through the hysteria. "It's acute ruminal tympany. Severe bloat. The animal is suffocating from a toxic gas buildup in its primary stomach." The villagers stopped and stared at me. The merchant looked up, tears streaking his dirt-caked face. Can you save him? He's my family's only livelihood. Without him, we will starve." "Yes," I said smoothly, stepping directly into the danger zone near the thrashing beast's hooves. "But my medical services aren't free. It will cost you a sack of rice, a slab of cured pork, and 50 silver coins." The merchant nodded frantically. "Anything. Just save him." I didn't hesitate. I borrowed a sharp, hollow iron reed from a nearby weaver, sanitized it with some strong, eye-watering liquor from a bystander's flask, and approached the thrashing ox. The villagers gasped and covered their eyes, fully expecting this frail young noble to be trampled to death. Instead, I pressed my hand firmly against the ox's left flank, mapping the anatomy in my head until I found the exact landmark, the paralumbar fossa. With one swift, practiced, and entirely ruthless motion, I drove the hollow iron reed directly through the thick hide and into the ox's stomach. A loud, violent hissing sound erupted as the trapped, toxic gas vented out into the open air. The smell was absolutely atrocious, like a rotting garbage dump on a hot summer day, but to my surgeon's brain, it was the sweet smell of success. Within seconds, the ox stopped thrashing. The massive, life-threatening swelling visibly deflated. The beast let out a long, exhausted breath and rested its heavy head on the dirt, its breathing returning to normal. The crowd was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop in the dirt. I calmly pulled the reed out, wiped my hands on a cloth someone handed me, and looked down at the stunned merchant. "Keep him off wet clover for a week and feed him dry hay. He'll be fine." The merchant dropped to his knees, kowtowing to me as if I were a descended god, a miracle worker, a divine beast healer. Word spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. By the end of the day, I hadn't just earned rice and pork. I had treated a local hunter's hound for a fractured leg using proper splinting techniques, diagnosed a flock of chickens with a dietary deficiency, and walked back up the mountain trail with a rented cart full of fresh food, thick wool blankets, medical herbs, and a heavy pouch jingling with silver coins. I kicked open the wooden doors of my ruined estate like a conquering hero returning from war. "We're eating meat tonight," I announced to the empty hall. The giant shadow panther limped out of the shadows, his crimson eyes locking onto the massive slab of cured pork in my hands. His long, thick tail gave one tiny, involuntary wag before he caught himself, his entire body stiffening as he forced it perfectly still. I smirked, carrying the supplies into the kitchen. "Yeah, I saw that. Don't worry, your secret is safe with me. I won't tell anyone you're actually a softie." Over the next month, my life fell into a glorious, incredibly profitable rhythm. The divine beast doctor of the Blackwood Mountain became a famous local legend. I used the silver to hire carpenters from the village. The crumbling stone walls were rebuilt, the leaky roof was tiled, and the overgrown courtyard was transformed into a clean, functional space. I bought medicinal herbs, sterilized bandages, and even commissioned the village blacksmith to forge proper surgical tools, scalpels, forceps, and retractors, to my exact modern specifications. The estate transformed from a haunted ruin into a bustling, fully functional animal sanctuary. Villagers brought me injured strays, broken-winged falcons, and sick livestock. I treated them all. The courtyard was soon filled with a chaotic mix of recovering animals. And right in the middle of it all, acting like he owned the place, was the giant shadow panther. His wounds had healed beautifully under my meticulous care, leaving him looking even more majestic and terrifying. But his behavior was becoming entirely hilarious. The fierce, bloodthirsty apex predator had inexplicably appointed himself the general manager of my sanctuary. If a stray dog barked too loudly while I was sleeping, the panther would shoot at a single glowing red glare, and the entire courtyard would instantly fall dead silent. He followed me everywhere. When I was sitting at my desk analyzing medical notes by candlelight, he rested his heavy head on my knee. When I cooked, he sat by the oven, watching my hands with an intensity that felt entirely too focused. He was brilliant, understanding complex commands, and flat out refusing to eat his food unless I personally handed it to him. I just chalked it up to him being a highly intelligent magical beast. One golden afternoon, I was sitting on the newly built wooden veranda, utterly exhausted after spending 3 hours delivering a breech calf down in the village. I was sipping a cup of hot tea when the panther hopped up gracefully beside me. He nudged his massive head under my hand, shamelessly demanding his daily ear scratches. I laughed, obliging him, rubbing the soft, thick fur behind his neck. He leaned his heavy weight against my side, radiating a comforting warmth. "You know," I murmured, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "My old life in the capital was an absolute nightmare. My family hated me, the politics were exhausting. But sitting here with you, this isn't so bad. I think I'm finally happy." The panther froze. He stopped leaning into my hand and slowly looked up at me. His crimson eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, the feral edge vanished entirely. It was replaced by a startling, profound gentleness. For a fleeting moment, I swore I didn't see an animal looking back at me. I saw a man. Someone lonely, fiercely protective, and dangerously devoted. My heart gave a weird, completely unhelpful flutter in my chest. I blinked, shaking my head, blaming the exhaustion for my overactive imagination. "Of course," I muttered to myself, taking another sip of tea. Peace in a dramatic transmigration novel is just a commercial break before the drama returns. I didn't know how right I was. My booming reputation as a miraculous healer had crossed the borders of the small villages and finally reached the gilded gates of the capital. And wherever success and attention bloomed, the green tea protagonist was sure to follow, wielding a pair of scissors to cut it down. The sound of horses whinnying and the heavy crunch of carriage wheels on gravel echoed up the mountain path. I looked up, my eyes narrowing as a lavish, gold-trimmed carriage bearing the Duke Thorn family crest rolled to a stop right in front of my newly built sanctuary gates. Trouble had arrived. End of Part 2. Part 3. The lavish, gold-trimmed carriage bearing the Duke Thorn family crest rolled to a halt, the heavy wheels crunching aggressively against the gravel of my newly built sanctuary driveway. A small crowd of villagers, local merchants who had come to buy my herbal remedies, and curious onlookers immediately gathered around the gates, whispering in awe. A carriage of this magnitude, pulled by four pristine white stallions, was a sight Oakhaven had never seen. The heavy, polished oak doors of the carriage swung open, and outstepped my absolute favorite person in the entire world, my stepbrother Kale. He looked exactly as the novel had described him, an ethereal, delicate beauty designed to invoke instant sympathy. He wore flowing, pure white silk robes embroidered with silver threads, his dark hair cascading perfectly over his shoulders, framing a face that looked perpetually innocent and fragile. He stepped down from the carriage, as if the very dirt beneath his boots was unworthy of his presence. Following closely behind him were four heavily armored elite guards from the capital, their hands resting menacingly on the hilts of their broadswords. In his arms, Kale carried an ornate, silver-gilded cage. Inside lay a breathtakingly rare creature, a moonlit snow fox. "Brother," Kale called out. His voice was pitched perfectly, trembling, soft, and just loud enough to ensure the entire crowd of gathered villagers could hear every single word. "I heard rumors that you were pretending to be a divine healer now. I was so worried about you." I didn't immediately look up. I was in the middle of wrapping a clean linen bandage around a young goat's injured leg. I secured the final knot, patted the goat's head, stood up, and methodically wiped my hands on a clean towel. Only then did I turn to face the protagonist of this ridiculous world. "Kale," I said, my voice entirely deadpan, devoid of any familial warmth. "I am not your brother anymore. Your mother and our father made sure of that when they stripped my name from the family registry and banished me. This is a medical clinic, not a theater stage for your dramatic monologues. What do you want?" Kale's large eyes widened in practiced, deeply wounded hurt. A few people in the crowd murmured, exchanging uneasy glances. He was playing the victim flawlessly, right on cue. "How can you speak to me so coldly after everything?" Kale sniffled, lifting the silver cage slightly. "I only came because my precious new companion, Snowflake, is dying. The imperial physicians in the capital cannot cure her. Since you claim to be a divine beast doctor now, I traveled all this way to beg for your help. I am even willing to forgive you for cruelly poisoning my silver-winged falcon, if only you will save her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The merchants who knew me stared at Kale, then back at me in shock. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Kale's trap was brilliantly obvious to anyone who wasn't blinded by his protagonist halo. He was painting himself as the merciful, saintly figure, graciously offering his evil, animal-killing older brother a second chance at redemption. If I refused to treat the fox, I proved to the world that I was still the cruel, heartless villain the Capitol believed me to be. If I tried to treat it and failed, he would expose me as a fraud, confirming his narrative that my healing was just a scam. It was a checkmate. Or, at least, it would have been if he were dealing with the original, emotionally desperate Julian Thorne. "Bring the fox inside the clinic," I said coldly, gesturing toward the examination room. Cale's lips twitched into a microscopic, victorious smirk that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He signaled his guards, and two of them carried the heavy silver cage into my sanctuary, placing it on my clean wooden examination table. The villagers crowded around the open doors, craning their necks to watch the drama unfold. I unlatched the cage door and gently, carefully lifted the moonlit snow fox out. My heart sank the moment I touched her. The poor creature was severely lethargic. Her breathing was frighteningly shallow and rapid. Her once legendary, fluffy white coat was falling out in massive clumps, exposing irritated, flaky, violently red skin beneath. She barely had the energy to lift her head, her beautiful icy blue eyes dull and glassy. Cale pulled out a silk handkerchief and elegantly dabbed at the corners of his dry eyes. "I have given her everything," he wept, turning slightly so his tragic profile was perfectly visible to the audience at the door. "The absolute finest quarters in the Duke's estate. The purest spring water brought down from the northern glaciers. I even had my personal servants groom her daily with crushed pearl dust and white lily pollen to ensure her fur remained as white as fresh snow. And yet, the heavens are so cruel to strike her down." My hands, which had been gently palpitating the fox's fragile ribcage, stopped dead. I slowly raised my head and locked eyes with my stepbrother. The air in the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. "You did what?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Cale blinked, trying to maintain his innocent, tearful expression, but a flicker of confusion crossed his features. I gave her the most luxurious care. I fed her a strict diet of only boiled white radishes and premium white rice, so her coat wouldn't be stained by the impurities of common, bloody meats. And I powdered her with pearls and pollen to keep her smelling sweet. The silence in the clinic was heavy, thick, and utterly absolute. I closed my eyes. I took a deep, steadying breath. In that brief moment of darkness, I felt the furious, wrathful spirits of 1,000 overworked, underpaid modern veterinarians enter my body. When I opened my eyes, the cold, clinical, unadulterated rage radiating from me was so intense that even Cale took a subconscious step back. "You absolute, unmitigated idiot," I hissed, my voice dropping into a lethal whisper that somehow echoed off the walls. Cale gasped, clutching his chest. "Brother, how can you insult me when my heart is breaking for my beloved pet?" I slammed my flat palm against the wooden table. The loud crack made the elite guards jump. "I am not insulting you. I am diagnosing you with terminal stupidity," I roared, pointing a finger directly at his flawless face. "This fox is a canid. She is an obligate carnivore. Feeding her a diet of boiled radishes and white rice is literally starving her to death. She is suffering from severe taurine, protein, and lipid deficiency. Her internal organs are actively shutting down as we speak because her body is consuming its own muscle mass just to keep her heart beating." The crowd at the door went entirely silent. Eyes widened in shock. Cale's pale face flushed a brilliant, ugly shade of crimson. That is a lie. I fed her purely. You know nothing. You feed her for aesthetics," I shouted, cutting him off completely, stepping around the table to tower over him. "And the pearl dust? The lily pollen? Foxes groom themselves with their tongues. You have been intentionally covering her in toxic respiratory irritants and indigestible crushed minerals. You are slowly, painfully poisoning your own pet just because you wanted a cute, white accessory to match your expensive outfits." Loud gasps erupted from the doorway. The butchers, farmers, and merchants of Oakhaven, people who knew exactly how strictly I managed animal diets, people who relied on healthy livestock to survive, stared at Cale in absolute unmasked horror. The illusion of the gentle, animal-loving saint shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before their eyes. "He's been starving a fox," a local butcher muttered loudly, disgust dripping from his voice. "Who in their right mind feeds a wild fox radishes? Even my youngest child knows foxes need meat," an old farmer scoffed, shaking his head. "And covering it in pearl dust, that's just sick cruelty dressed up as wealth." Cale panicked. The script had flipped entirely. He wasn't the tragic victim anymore. He was the ignorant abuser, exposed with cold, undeniable, brutal medical logic in front of an audience. You are just jealous of me. Kale shrieked, dropping the soft-spoken, angelic act entirely. His voice turned shrill, his face contorting in genuine malice. You are making this up to humiliate me and ruin my reputation. Guards, take my fox back immediately. We are leaving this filthy hovel. The two heavily armored guards stepped forward, their metal boots clanking loudly against the wooden floor, reaching out to grab the fragile snow fox from my examination table. Before they could even cross the threshold, a terrifying, bone-rattling roar shook the very foundations of the clinic. The giant shadow panther stepped out from the darkened hallway of my living quarters. He didn't walk, he stalked. His midnight black hackles were raised high, his massive fangs bared in a vicious, dripping sneer. The elite Capitol guards froze in their tracks, the color draining instantly from their faces. The sheer, overwhelming killing intent radiating from the beast was so thick it was hard to breathe. The panther stepped squarely in front of the examination table, planting his massive paws between me and Kale's men. He let out another guttural, vibrating snarl that clearly translated to, "Take one more step toward him, and I will sever your spine from your body." I didn't even flinch at the panther's display. I crossed my arms and looked at my terrified stepbrother, who was now trembling uncontrollably, pressing his back against the wall. "The fox stays here," I declared with absolute, unwavering authority. "She requires immediate intravenous hydration and a highly controlled, strictly carnivorous refeeding protocol if she is going to survive the night. If you try to take her, my assistant here will gladly show you the door." Through the window. Kale trembled, his face a mix of profound humiliation and sheer terror. He looked at the murmuring, angry crowd of villagers blocking the exit, then at the demonic panther guarding me like I was a priceless treasure. He had lost, and he knew it. Gritting his perfect teeth, he turned on his heel. "You will regret this, Julian," he hissed venomously. "This isn't over." He fled out the door and sprinted to his lavish carriage, leaving his elite guards to awkwardly scramble after him, practically tripping over their own swords in their rush to escape the panther's glowing red glare. The carriage sped away down the mountain path in a frantic cloud of dust. The crowd in the courtyard erupted into cheers, clapping and praising my medical genius, actively mocking the fleeing noble. I sighed, waving them off with a tired smile, and turned my attention back to the shivering little snow fox on the table. "Don't worry, little lady," I murmured softly, my anger dissolving into gentle professionalism as I prepared a syringe of saline and essential nutrients. "I'm going to get you a nice, juicy piece of minced chicken. You are safe now." Once the crowd dispersed and the sanctuary fell quiet again, I felt a heavy, warm weight rest against my hip. I looked down. The terrifying, murderous shadow panther had sat down right beside my leg, pressing his massive, scarred head affectionately against my thigh. He looked up at me. His crimson eyes were completely devoid of anger or feral rage. Instead, they were filled with an unmistakable, overwhelming sense of pride. I huffed a soft laugh, reaching down to aggressively ruffle his ears. He didn't even pull away or whine this time. He just closed his eyes and leaned heavily into my touch, a deep, resonant purr vibrating through his massive chest and vibrating into my legs. "Good job backing me up, big guy," I whispered, scratching under his chin. "Though I'm pretty sure you just traumatized the Capitol's elite guard force for the rest of their lives." The panther simply bumped his wet nose against my hand, thoroughly enjoying the praise. What I didn't realize was that General Draven wasn't just acting like an overgrown guard dog. He was looking at me, the fierce, brilliant, fiercely protective veterinarian who had just verbally decimated a noble without a drop of fear, and making a very permanent, very dangerous decision about his own future. 3 days later, the reality of my situation hit me with the force of a runaway freight train. You know that hollow, stomach-dropping sensation you get when you reach for your phone in your pocket and realize it's not there? Imagine that feeling, but multiply it by 1,000 and replace the phone with a 300-pound, emotionally supportive apex predator. I woke up, stretched my arms with a satisfying groan, and blindly patted the wooden floor beside my bed. My hand hit empty, cold floorboards. I blinked, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Big guy," I called out, fully expecting to hear the familiar, heavy thump-thump of his massive tail hitting the ground. Silence. I threw off the heavy wool blankets and checked the kitchen. Empty. I checked the courtyard, the stables, and the clinic room. The main gate was securely latched from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken fences. He was just gone. I stood in the middle of the empty courtyard, the cold morning mist wrapping around my ankles like damp ghosts. Logically, my modern, highly educated brain knew this was for the best. He was a wild, magical beast, a creature of the deep forest. I had successfully healed him. His wounds were closed, his strength had returned, and he had simply gone back to his natural habitat. That was exactly how veterinary medicine worked. You fix them, and you let them go back to the wild. Emotionally, however, I felt like someone had taken a melon baller and scooped out a massive chunk of my chest. I slumped onto the porch steps, burying my face in my hands. Stupid, I muttered to myself, my voice thick. You got emotionally attached to a giant, terrifying stray cat. What did you expect? A heartfelt goodbye letter and a postcard from the woods. I forced myself to stand up, slapping my cheeks to snap out of it. I had a sanctuary to run. I had animals that depended on me. The little snow fox from my stepbrother, whom I had unceremoniously named Tofu, was recovering beautifully and required her morning feeding. I didn't have the time or the luxury to mope around like a dumped teenager. I threw myself into my work with an absolute vengeance. Tofu was thriving on a strict, balanced diet of minced chicken and organ meats. Her beautiful white coat was growing back thick and glossy, and she had developed a hilarious habit of riding around on my shoulders like a very expensive, very sassy winter scarf, hissing at the local farm dogs. But the nights were undeniably the hardest. I found myself accidentally cooking extra portions of meat out of habit, staring at the empty spot by the oven where a massive black shadow used to sit and watch me. A full week passed. Then, too, just as I had finally convinced myself to stop looking toward the dark tree-line of the shadowed woods every time a dry branch snapped, the earth began to shake. It wasn't a metaphor. The ground beneath my boots literally trembled. I was in the middle of rebandaging a workhorse's knee when the chaotic, deafening clatter of heavy steel armor, galloping hooves, and loud shouting erupted from the mountain path leading up to my sanctuary walls. The villagers who were trading goods outside were screaming, scattering into the trees like frightened chickens. "The demon general!" someone shrieked in the distance. "The Vanguard army is here. Run!" My blood ran instantly cold. The Vanguard army? In the novel, General Draven, the demon of the north, was the Emperor's deadliest weapon. He was a man who had slaughtered tens of thousands on the battlefield, a warlord whose reputation was so soaked in blood and terror that parents in the capital used his name to scare their misbehaving children into going to bed. What the hell was the most lethal military force in the Empire doing at my peaceful animal clinic? I grabbed a heavy iron soup ladle from the outdoor kitchen, because apparently, in moments of sheer panic, my fight-or-flight response chose baking utensils as a primary weapon and marched out to the front courtyard. The heavy wooden gates of my sanctuary were thrown wide open. 2 rows of heavily armored, terrifyingly disciplined soldiers marched in, their movements perfectly synchronized, forming a corridor of steel and intimidation. And walking down the center of that corridor was him. If I thought the protagonist, Kale, was handsome, it was only because I hadn't yet seen the final boss of the author's character design. General Draven was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in dark, intricate, matte black armor that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. His dark hair was tied back severely, his jawline looked sharp enough to cut through solid glass, and his eyes. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. His eyes were a deep, piercing, unmistakable crimson red. End of Part 3. Part 4. He stopped exactly 3 paces from me, his presence suffocatingly heavy. The entire courtyard went dead silent. Even the injured animals seemed to hold their breath. The wind itself felt like it had stopped blowing, too terrified to move in the presence of the demon of the north. I stood there, wearing a mud-stained leather apron, clutching my heavy iron soup ladle like it was the legendary sword Excalibur, and stared up at the most dangerous man in the Empire. I was waiting for the execution order. The original Julian Thorne had offended his own family so badly they banished him to the wilderness. Had he somehow, in some forgotten chapter of the novel, offended the demon general too? Was this it? Was I going to be beheaded because of some stupid plot point I couldn't remember? General Draven stared down at me. His crimson gaze swept over my messy, wind-blown hair, the dirt smudged across my cheek, the ridiculous iron ladle in my grip, and finally, Tofu the snow fox, who was currently draped over my shoulder, bravely hissing at the most lethal warlord in existence. He raised a heavily gauntlet hand. I squeezed my eyes shut and braced myself for the sharp sting of a blade. Instead, a sharp snap of his fingers echoed through the quiet courtyard. 4 elite soldiers stepped forward from the ranks, carrying 2 massive, iron-bound wooden chests. They dropped them directly at my feet with a deafening thud that rattled the floorboards of the veranda. The heavy latches popped open, revealing enough gleaming gold and silver ingots to buy my entire mountain, the village of Oakhaven below it, and probably a small neighboring kingdom. I stared at the blinding pile of gold. Then, I slowly looked back up at the imposing general. I lowered my soup ladle an inch. Is this a robbery in reverse? I asked, my corporate slave brain completely short-circuiting the situation. The soldiers behind him collectively gasped, their faces draining of color, utterly horrified by my insolence. You didn't crack jokes with the demon of the north. General Draven didn't even blink. His crimson eyes remained locked on my face. I am severely injured, the general stated. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated right through my ribcage and pooled warmly in my stomach. The imperial physicians in the capital are incompetent fools. I require a sanctuary to recuperate. A quiet, heavily controlled, healing environment. I am moving in. I blinked. Once. Twice. Sir, I said slowly, trying to process the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the situation. This is a veterinary clinic. I treat cows, goats, ducks, and the occasional feral feline. I am a beast healer. I am not a human doctor. General Draven stepped closer, the dark metal of his armor clinking softly, ominously. He looked down at me, completely unfazed by my rejection. I have been told your medical skills are divine, he replied smoothly, crossing his arms over his broad chest. And I am willing to pay triple your highest rate for a private room, 3 hot meals a day, and your undivided personal attention. He gestured lazily to the overflowing chests of gold. Consider this a down payment. Morally, I should have said no. I should have told the dangerous, blood-soaked warlord to take his terrifying army and leave my peaceful, hard-earned retirement alone. I didn't want political entanglements, and I certainly didn't want the Emperor's deadliest weapon sleeping down the hall. But then, I looked at the gold. I thought about the new, state-of-the-art quarantine barn I wanted to build. I thought about the expensive, imported medicinal herbs I couldn't afford. The ghost of my modern, unpaid, overworked millennial self aggressively grabbed the steering wheel of my brain. Cash up front, I asked, my voice suddenly shifting into a very crisp, professional tone. General Draven's sharp lips twitched upward by a microscopic, fascinating fraction. Up front, unmarked, tax-free, he confirmed. I kicked the lid of one chest shut with my boot and flashed him my brightest, most brilliant customer service smile. Welcome to the Blackwood Mountain Sanctuary, General. Breakfast is served precisely at 6 in the morning, and we have a very strict, no biting the staff policy. The soldiers looked like they were going to pass out from sheer terror at my tone, but the general just hummed a low, pleased sound and strode past me into the main house like he already owned the place. And just like that, I accidentally became the live-in landlord and personal physician to the Empire's most terrifying tyrant. Having a warlord as a roommate was an incredibly surreal experience. I had expected him to be demanding, cruel, violently arrogant, or at least obnoxiously loud. But General Draven was none of those things. Instead, he was quiet, intensely observant, and possessed an absolutely staggering, breathtaking lack of personal boundaries. He dismissed his entire vanguard army immediately, keeping only 2 silent, highly trained shadow guards stationed outside the estate gates to keep the villagers at bay. Inside the walls, it was just me, the recovering animals, and him. And I mean just him, because he flat out refused to leave my side. If I was grinding herbs in the apothecary, he was sitting in the corner chair, reading classified military reports while intensely watching my hands move. If I was chopping vegetables in the kitchen, he was leaning against the doorframe, tracking my movements with those burning red eyes. It was like living with a very large, very well-armed, breathtakingly handsome shadow. Do you not have a literal war to wage? I asked him one afternoon, exasperated as I tried to step around his massive frame to reach the spice rack. The northern borders are currently quiet, he replied smoothly, not moving an inch, forcing me to brush directly against his solid chest to grab a jar of star anise. The intense heat radiating off his body was entirely, frustratingly distracting. Besides, I am a patient on official medical leave. I must follow my doctor's orders to rest. I never ordered you to stand in my kitchen and aggressively supervise my soup. I shot back, furiously stirring the pot to hide the flush creeping up my neck. He merely hummed, reaching over my shoulder to casually steal a piece of sliced cucumber from my cutting board. But the real chaos didn't start until I realized that the great and terrible demon general was insanely, unbelievably jealous of my animal patients. It started with a litter of stray kittens a local farmer had brought in. They were malnourished, frightened, and needed bottle feeding every few hours. One quiet evening, I was sitting on the veranda, happily letting three tiny, purring fluff balls climb all over my lap. I was cooing at them, completely relaxed, when the temperature on the porch suddenly plummeted. General Draven stood at the edge of the veranda, staring at the kittens. He wasn't just looking at them. He was glaring at them with the focused, lethal intensity of a man preparing to lay siege to an enemy fortress. The kittens, possessing excellent natural survival instincts, immediately stopped purring, scrambled frantically off my lap, and hid underneath the wooden floorboards. "What did you do that for?" I demanded, glaring up at him. They were finally settling down. Draven crossed his arms, his expression perfectly blank, though his sharp jaw was visibly tight. "They were shedding on your clean robes. It is unhygienic for a physician." Before I could argue, he smoothly sat down right next to me. He didn't leave a single inch of space between us. His broad shoulder pressed firmly against mine, his heavily muscled thigh entirely flush with my own. He casually opened a military scroll, acting as if he hadn't just bullied three baby animals out of their comfortable spot, just so he could aggressively claim it for himself. I stared at the side of his handsome face, utterly bewildered. Was the demon general seriously competing with kittens for my attention? The answer, I soon discovered, was an emphatic yes. He competed with the kittens. He competed with Tofu the snow fox, who regularly hissed at him from her perch on my shoulders. He even competed with a particularly affectionate draft horse, glaring at the poor beast until it nervously backed away from the fence so Draven could be the one to hand me a clean towel. But as the days bled into weeks, the sheer, ridiculous absurdity of his jealousy started to crack open a locked door in my mind. A door I had kept very tightly shut because the implications were entirely too crazy to entertain. Because General Draven didn't just share my space, he shared very specific, very familiar habits. One night, I made a hearty pork and vegetable stew, throwing in a large handful of boiled radishes to stretch the meal. We sat at the low wooden table, the fire crackling in the hearth. I watched, absolutely fascinated, as the terrifying warlord meticulously, with surgical precision, picked every single piece of boiled radish out of his bowl and placed them on a side plate. His expression was one of profound, aristocratic disgust. My chopsticks paused halfway to my mouth. My mind flashed back to the giant shadow panther, turning his massive, majestic head away from the vegetable mush I had offered him on his first morning. I stared at Draven. He looked up, caught me staring, and quickly shoved a large piece of pork into his mouth, trying to look dignified. I narrowed my eyes. Coincidence, I told myself. Lots of people hate radishes. But the coincidences kept piling up. Like the way he always positioned his body between me and the main gate when strangers approached. Or the way he always knew exactly when I was tired, wordlessly sliding a cup of hot chamomile tea onto my desk before I even realized I was thirsty. And then came the storm. A massive, violent autumn thunderstorm rolled in off the northern mountains. Thunder cracked so loud the stone foundations of the clinic shook. The animals were completely panicked. I spent 3 grueling hours running in the torrential rain between the pens, securing heavy wooden shutters, reinforcing fences, and soothing terrified livestock. By the time the storm finally broke and the rain settled into a steady freezing downpour, I was soaked to the bone, shivering violently and entirely, thoroughly exhausted. I stumbled into the main hall, dripping cold water onto the floorboards. The room was dark, lit only by the dying, glowing embers of the hearth. Suddenly, a heavy, fur-lined cloak was draped over my trembling shoulders. The suffocating warmth was immediate. I looked up. Draven was standing there, his crimson eyes reflecting the faint, dancing firelight. "You do not know when to stop," he murmured, his voice incredibly rough. He didn't step back. He reached up, his large, calloused hands gently taking the towel from my numb grip. He began to dry my wet hair. The gesture was so quiet, so intimate, so devastatingly gentle that my breath hitched. I stood frozen, trapped in the intoxicating scent of rain, cold steel, and rich sandalwood as he worked the towel through my hair. My tired brain completely bypassed my modern common sense. I was so exhausted that my body operated on pure, unguarded muscle memory. Without thinking, I leaned forward and rested my forehead directly against the center of his chest with a soft, weary sigh. Draven went perfectly, rigidly still. His hands stopped moving. His heartbeat, thundering rapidly beneath his dark tunic, was suddenly the loudest sound in the quiet room. I felt him slowly, hesitantly wrap his strong arms around me, pulling me flush against his solid warmth. He rested his chin gently on the top of my head, letting out a long, shaky breath that sounded like absolute surrender. "You," I mumbled sleepily into his chest. are acting exactly like a giant, overgrown guard cat. I felt his chest rumble with a low, rich chuckle. And you, he whispered into my hair, are the only person in this empire who has ever dared to treat me like one and lived to tell the tale. My eyes snapped open in the dark. My sleepiness vanished instantly, replaced by a violent, electric shock of pure, unadulterated realization. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my brain. The radishes, the glaring at the other animals, the fierce, borderline obsessive protectiveness, the crimson red eyes, the exact, precise location of the nasty scar on his left flank, which I had accidentally glimpsed when he was changing his robes yesterday. I stitched that scar. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. The giant, terrifying goth panther. The bleeding, majestic beast I had scolded, bullied into eating mush, and aggressively pet behind the ears. It wasn't just a magical beast. It was a cursed man. It was him. General Draven, the demon of the north, was the stray cat I had adopted in the woods. I pushed myself back from his chest, my face burning so hot it could have evaporated the rain right off my clothes. He looked down at me, his expression softening into a look of such raw, undisguised affection that it made my knees genuinely weak. You know, he stated softly. It wasn't a question. I opened my mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. You purred. I choked out, my voice cracking in pure, mortified horror as I realized exactly how I had treated the most dangerous man alive. I scratched you under the chin, and you purred like a literal kitten. You're the supreme commander of the Imperial Army. Draven did not look ashamed. In fact, a slow, devastatingly handsome, utterly possessive smirk spread across his sharp face. He leaned down, trapping me between his arms against the wooden pillar, his voice dropping an entire octave. And as your patient, he murmured, his crimson eyes gleaming with predatory amusement, I believe I am long overdue for my daily treatment, Dr. Thorne. I did what any highly educated, financially independent, and deeply terrified millennial would do when cornered by an incredibly attractive, insanely possessive warlord. I panicked, shoved the damp towel onto his very muscular chest, and speed-walked to my bedroom, slamming and locking the heavy door behind me. Good night, General. I squeaked, burying my burning face in my pillow. Outside my door, I heard a low, rumbling chuckle that did absolutely nothing to calm my racing heart. End of Part 4. Part 5. The next morning, the tension in the sanctuary was thick enough to cut with a surgical scalpel. I aggressively avoided making eye contact with General Draven. I moved around the kitchen with the frantic, rigid energy of a man trying to pretend that his entire worldview hadn't just been completely shattered. Draven, on the other hand, sat at the small wooden breakfast table, casually sipping his morning tea. He looked entirely too relaxed, his broad shoulders resting against the wall, his crimson eyes tracking my every frantic movement with dark, predatory amusement. You are pouring boiling water directly onto the table, Dr. Thorne, he observed smoothly, his deep voice practically vibrating with suppressed laughter. I snapped out of my panic daze, gasping as I realized the hot water had completely missed my teacup and was currently forming a steaming puddle on the floorboards. I hastily set the heavy iron teapot down, my face flushing furiously. I was testing the structural integrity of the wood. I lied through my teeth, grabbing a rag to aggressively wipe up the mess. It's a very common architectural practice. You wouldn't understand. Of course, Draven hummed, taking another slow sip of his tea. My apologies for questioning your methods. By the way, my chin is feeling remarkably unscratched this morning. As my physician, don't you think? Before I could formulate a sufficiently biting, sarcastic response to defend whatever tiny shred of dignity I had left, the heavy wooden gates of the sanctuary were thrown violently open. The chaotic, deafening clatter of galloping hooves, clanking imperial armor, and shouting shattered the peaceful morning air. Tofu, the snow fox, let out a sharp hiss from her spot on the windowsill, her white fur puffing up in alarm. I dropped the rag and stepped out onto the veranda, Draven immediately rising to stand right behind me, his playful demeanor vanishing in an instant. The imposing, relaxed roommate was gone. The demon of the north had seamlessly taken his place, his aura turning freezing and lethal. An imperial eunuch, dressed in vibrant, excessively embroidered silk robes, marched into the center of my courtyard. He was flanked by 2 rows of heavily armed royal guards bearing the emperor's golden crest. The eunuch pinched his nose delicately, turning his face up as if the faint scent of hay, medicinal herbs, and animal feed was personally offending his distinguished ancestors. He unrolled a heavy, gold-trimmed scroll with a dramatic flick of his wrists. By direct order of His Imperial Majesty, the eunuch announced, his voice a shrill, nasal whine that grated against my eardrums. The exiled noble and supposed beast healer, Julian Thorne, is hereby summoned to the Imperial Palace immediately. I froze. The Imperial Palace. The very place the original Julian Thorne had been violently banished from in absolute disgrace. The place where my biological father and my two-faced stepbrother resided. I wiped my damp hands on my leatherwork apron, keeping my expression neutral. May I ask why, eunuch? The man scoffed, looking at my mud-stained boots with blatant disgust. The Emperor's prized, sacred hunting gerfalcon has fallen gravely ill. The royal physicians are completely baffled and cannot cure it. Since rumors of your miracles have reached the capital, you are to cure the beast. If you fail to save the Emperor's favorite creature, well, a disgraced exile's life is very cheap. The executioner's blade is always sharp. Before I could fully process the blatant, casual death threat delivered before I even had my morning tea, a massive shadow fell over the eunuch. General Draven stepped off the wooden veranda and into the sunlight. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The Imperial guards, who had been standing tall and arrogant, suddenly shrank back, their hands trembling violently on the hilts of their swords. The eunuch's arrogant sneer dissolved into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror as he recognized the towering, armor-clad warlord stepping toward him. Draven didn't draw a weapon, but the pure killing intent radiating from his body was heavier than any physical blade. His crimson eyes locked onto the trembling eunuch, his large hand resting casually on the hilt of his broadsword. You will address him as Dr. Thorne. Draven's voice dropped to a lethal, chilling whisper that carried across the silent courtyard. And you will speak to him with the absolute respect owed to the man who saved my life. Because if you disrespect him again, I will personally demonstrate exactly how cheap your life is. The eunuch turned the color of spoiled milk. He dropped to his knees so fast I thought I heard his kneecaps shatter against the gravel. General Draven, forgive this lowly one, the man stammered, pressing his forehead directly into the dirt, entirely forgetting his previous disgust for the ground. I meant no disrespect. Please spare me. I sighed, rubbing my temples. A headache was already forming right behind my eyes. I'll go pack my medical bag, I muttered, turning back into the clinic. When I emerged 5 minutes later, carrying a sturdy leather satchel packed with syringes, scalpels, sterile bandages, and an array of emergency herbs, Draven was already waiting by a sleek, unmarked black carriage that his own shadow guards had brought around. I am coming with you, he stated. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute, immovable fact. I didn't argue. Considering I was walking right back into the viper's nest that had originally gotten this body killed, I had a very strong feeling I was going to need a very large, very terrifying guard cat today. The carriage ride down the mountain and toward the capital was agonizingly quiet, yet incredibly thick with unspoken tension. I sat on one side of the plush velvet cabin, nervously tapping my fingers against my medical bag. Draven sat opposite me, his long legs stretched out, taking up most of the space. He didn't say a word, but his crimson eyes never left my face, watching me with a steady, grounding intensity. When the massive, imposing stone structures of the Imperial City finally loomed overhead, my stomach did a nervous flip. The sheer scale of the golden roofs, the towering crimson pillars, and the thousands of heavily armed guards was a stark contrast to my peaceful, quiet mountain sanctuary. We were escorted through labyrinthine corridors until the grand doors of the great throne room were pushed open. The sheer wealth on display inside made my inner accountant weep tears of despair. The floors were polished white jade, the pillars were wrapped in solid gold dragons, and the ceiling was painted with crushed lapis lazuli. But I didn't have time to admire the extravagant architecture. Standing at the center of the massive hall, right beside the Emperor's elevated golden throne, was the Crown Prince. Next to him, clinging to his arm like a fragile, dependent flower, was my stepbrother, Kale. And standing just behind them, wearing the heavy purple robes of a high-ranking official, was Duke Thorne, my biological father, the man who had thrown me out like garbage. The moment my father saw me walk through the grand doors, his face twisted in absolute, visceral fury. You, the Duke bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He pointed a trembling, enraged finger at me. I wiped your cursed name from the family registry. I banished you to rot in the mountains for your crimes. How dare you show your face in the imperial court? Kale immediately shrank behind the crown prince's arm, his eyes wide and glistening with perfectly timed tears. Brother, Kale gasped, his voice trembling beautifully. After you cruelly poisoned my poor silver-winged falcon, have you now come to cause more tragedy? Have you come to curse the Emperor's bird as well? The Crown Prince, entirely blinded by Kale's manipulative act, sneered at me. His gaze dripped with disgust. A vicious, animal-killing exile dares to stand before the Emperor? This man is a fraud and a murderer. Guards, seize him and throw him into the dungeons. 2 royal guards stepped forward to grab my arms. I didn't even get the chance to open my mouth to defend myself before General Draven stepped smoothly, seamlessly in front of me. His massive frame completely shielded me from the rest of the hall. The dark, light-absorbing metal of his armor seemed to cast a physical shadow over the approaching guards, who immediately froze, their eyes widening in panic. "He is here under my absolute protection," Draven said. His voice wasn't a shout, but it echoed like a crack of thunder through the massive hall. "And he is here by his Imperial Majesty's direct summons. Anyone who touches him loses their hands." The Crown Prince flinched, instinctively taking a step back. Even royalty feared the demon general. Duke Thorne's face drained of color, his furious rant dying in his throat as he realized exactly who had escorted his banished, worthless son into the palace. The Emperor, sitting heavily on his elevated throne, waved a weary, jewel-encrusted hand. He looked pale and deeply stressed. "Enough. Silence, all of you," the Emperor boomed, his voice carrying the absolute weight of the Empire. "I summoned a Master Beast Doctor, not a family feud. General Draven is correct. Julian Thorne is here on my orders. Save my falcon, boy, or face the consequences. Bring in the bird." A terrified royal servant rushed forward, carrying a massive, gilded, jewel-encrusted cage. He placed it carefully on a velvet-draped table in the center of the room, bowing deeply before retreating. Inside the cage, a magnificent, pure white gerfalcon lay on its side. It was a breathtaking creature, but right now, it looked completely miserable. It was panting shallowly, its beak slightly open, its eyes dull and glassy. It didn't even have the energy to lift its head or fluff its feathers against the cold air of the hall. I immediately switched out of the persona of an exiled noble and straight into work mode. The fear, the family drama, the intimidating wealth of the Emperor, it all vanished. There was only the patient. I approached the cage, completely ignoring the venomous glares of my father, the Crown Prince, and the royal physicians who were standing to the side, muttering about how a banished youth could never succeed where they had failed. I unlatched the golden door and reached inside, my hands moving with gentle, practiced precision over the bird's feathered chest and throat. As my fingers brushed over the falcon's crop, the muscular pouch near its throat where birds of prey store food before digestion, I stopped. The crop was massively distended. It felt as hard as a solid rock beneath my fingers, and when I leaned closer, I could smell the faint, unmistakable odor of yeast and toxic fermentation coming from the bird's beak. I frowned, gently palpating the rock-hard area, my mind rapidly calculating the symptoms. "This is a severe crop impaction," I announced clearly, my voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent throne room. "Food has rotted and solidified inside the bird's throat, causing a massive, toxic bacterial buildup. Its digestive tract is entirely blocked." I turned my head to look directly at the head royal physician. What exactly has this apex predator been eating for the past 3 days? End of Part 5. Part 6. The head royal physician stepped forward, stroking his long, white beard defensively, clearly insulted by my question. "It has been fed only the absolute purest, highest quality raw meat, exactly as an imperial raptor should be. We have overseen its diet strictly." I narrowed my eyes, my fingers still resting gently on the bird's throat. "Raw meat digests quickly and cleanly. This feels like a solid, incredibly dense, carbohydrate-heavy mass. Birds of prey lack the enzymes to break down grains, starches, or complex sugars." Suddenly, Kale let out a small, pathetic, trembling gasp. Oh no," he whispered, his delicate hands flying to cover his mouth. The Crown Prince immediately pulled Kale closer, his face full of arrogant concern. "Kale, my sweet, what is it?" Kale sobbed, burying his face in the Crown Prince's opulent robes. I only wanted to tame the fierce beast. It always looked so angry in its cage. I thought if I fed it sweet osmanthus cakes and honey pastries, it would become gentle and sweet-natured, like a dove." My brain effectively flatlined. I stared at the saintly protagonist. He had fed a purely carnivorous, highly lethal apex predator hunting falcon sugary baked goods to make it sweet. "You fed a gerfalcon baked goods," I repeated, my voice entirely devoid of all emotion, staring at him like he was a specimen under a microscope. "You gave an obligate carnivore a pastry." "I was just trying to show it love," Kale cried, his tears flowing freely as the Crown Prince rubbed his back soothingly. Duke Thorne stepped forward, his face purple with rage, glaring fiercely at me. "Do not speak to your brother in that tone, Julian. He acted out of the pureness of his heart. You, on the other hand, only know cruelty." I closed my eyes and prayed for the patience of a saint, because if I didn't get it, I was going to commit a felony right here in the throne room. The sheer, unadulterated stupidity in this family was suffocating. His pure heart just gave this bird a lethal case of sauerkraut. I snapped, my patience entirely evaporating. I turned my back on my furious father and pulled a sterile, thin rubber tube and a massive syringe of saline from my medical bag. "Someone hold its wings steady," I ordered, looking at the nearest royal guard. The guard hesitated, looking nervously toward the Emperor. But before anyone else could move, General Draven stepped forward. His massive, dark metal gauntlets reached out, his hands moving with surprising, breathtaking gentleness as he firmly pinned the falcon's powerful wings to its sides, securing the bird without hurting it. Working rapidly, I lubricated the rubber tube, carefully slid it down the bird's throat, bypassing the trachea, and began aggressively flushing the hardened mass of rotting pastry out of its crop. The smell that suddenly hit the pristine throne room was absolutely apocalyptic. It smelled like a bakery that had died, rotted in the sun, and come back to life as a zombie. Several high-ranking ministers gagged loudly, covering their mouths. Duke Thorne dramatically pinched his nose, turning green. I ignored them all, expertly massaging the crop with my thumbs until the blockage was entirely cleared, flushing the toxins out before administering a concentrated dose of herbal antibiotics straight into the bird's system. Within minutes, the crisis passed. The falcon violently shook its white feathers, stood up unsteadily on its razor-sharp talons, and let out a sharp, ear-piercing screech that echoed triumphantly off the vaulted ceilings. It was alive. The Emperor's stressed posture immediately relaxed, his eyes lighting up with sheer delight. "Incredible," he boomed, clapping his hands. "A true medical miracle." But Cale wasn't finished. Seeing his golden opportunity for praise slipping away, and realizing the Emperor was pleased with the brother he despised, Cale pointed a trembling finger at me. "Your Majesty." Cale shrieked, panic coloring his voice. He used dark witchcraft. Look at his strange, unnatural tools. The Julian I grew up with knew absolutely nothing about medicine. He is possessed by a demon. He must be executed before he curses us all. The Crown Prince, eager to defend his beloved, immediately drew his jeweled sword. "Guards, seize the demon." Clang. The deafening sound of heavy steel hitting the marble floor instantly silenced the room. General Draven had drawn his own weapon, a massive, terrifying, blood-soaked broadsword. But he didn't point it at the approaching guards. He pointed the lethal tip directly at the throat of the Crown Prince. "The only demon in this room," Draven said, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood in their veins, "is the one who starves foxes and poisons falcons for his own vanity." The Emperor slowly sat forward on his throne, his joy evaporating into a dangerous, calculating stillness. "What is the meaning of this, General?" Draven didn't lower his sword a single inch. His crimson eyes remained locked on the terrified Crown Prince. "This boy," Draven sneered, shifting his glare to Cale, who squeaked in terror, "has built a flawless reputation on false kindness. Just last month, he brought a rare snow fox to Dr. Thorne's clinic. He had been intentionally starving it on a diet of radishes just to keep its coat purely white." Loud, scandalized whispers erupted through the hall. Nobles exchanged shocked, disgusted glances. "And today," Draven continued ruthlessly, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "he admits to poisoning your Majesty's prized hunting bird with pastries out of sheer, blinding ignorance." Draven paused, letting the weight of his words settle before dropping the absolute nuke. "But that is not his worst crime, Your Majesty. My military intelligence network investigated Dr. Thorne's sudden, suspicious exile." Duke Thorne suddenly looked very, very pale. He took a stumbling step forward. "General," my father stammered, sweat beading on his forehead, "this is a private family matter." "Silence," the Emperor roared, silencing the Duke instantly. Draven smirked coldly. Cale poisoned his own silver-winged falcon to frame his older brother. "We found the servant he bribed to plant the poison under Julian's mattress. We have a full, signed confession." The great hall exploded into absolute chaos. Cale dropped to his knees, his mask of flawless innocence shattering completely into a million ugly pieces. "No, I didn't. He's lying. I'm innocent," he shrieked, reaching out for the Crown Prince. But the Crown Prince just stared at Cale, his face twisted in horror, stepping away from the weeping boy as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease. The Emperor's heavy, terrifying gaze shifted from the weeping protagonist directly to my biological father. It was the calculating, merciless gaze of a ruler who had just realized his most trusted duke was a gullible, easily manipulated fool. "Duke Thorn," the Emperor boomed, his voice dripping with lethal venom. "You brutally exiled your own legitimate son, a medical genius who just saved my prized falcon, over the lies of a malicious, animal-abusing brat? Your judgment is entirely compromised. You are a disgrace to this court." The Emperor stood up. "Guards, strip Duke Thorn of his official seal and his noble titles immediately, and confine Kale to the deepest levels of the Imperial dungeons for endangering royal property and lying to the throne." My father collapsed to the marble floor in pure shock, hyperventilating as the royal guards forcefully ripped the purple robes of office from his shoulders. At the same time, two heavily armored men grabbed a screaming, weeping Kale by the arms, dragging him out of the great hall. The face-slapping was absolute. It was a flawless, devastating, utterly satisfying victory. The Emperor turned back to me, his harsh expression softening into deep, genuine respect. "Dr. Thorn, you have done the Empire and myself a great service today. Name your reward. Gold, land, a position as the head royal physician here in the capital." I bowed deeply and respectfully. "Your Majesty, I am deeply honored," I said clearly. "But I require no court position. I only ask to be left in peace to run my animal sanctuary in the northern mountains. My patients need me there." The Emperor let out a booming, genuine laugh that echoed warmly through the hall. "A humble man, truly rare in this court. Very well. You shall have exclusive, limitless royal funding for your sanctuary, and no noble shall ever dare interfere with your affairs again." I walked out of the imperial palace feeling like I was floating on a cloud. The original owner's debts were cleared. The toxic family was utterly ruined. The green tea stepbrother was rotting in a dungeon. And thanks to the royal treasury, I was about to be filthy, stinking rich. As soon as Draven and I stepped back into the privacy of our unmarked carriage and the doors closed, the adrenaline completely left my body. I slumped heavily against the plush velvet seats, letting out a long, pathetic groan of pure exhaustion. "My spine is going to file a lawsuit against me," I muttered, closing my eyes and tilting my head back. Suddenly, I felt a strong, heavily muscled arm wrap firmly around my waist. Before I could even open my eyes, I was pulled effortlessly across the wide seat. I gasped as I found myself practically sitting in General Draven's lap. The carriage jolted forward, but his grip was like iron, keeping me perfectly, intimately steady against his broad chest. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice betraying a slight, entirely unprofessional tremor. He looked down at me. His crimson eyes were incredibly dark, intense, and utterly unreadable. "Collecting my payment," he murmured, his breath brushing warmly against my jaw. End of Part 6. Part 7. I blinked, my brain struggling to process the sudden shift in gravity and the overwhelming proximity of the Empire's most lethal weapon. "Payment," I echoed, my voice sounding entirely too breathless. "I thought you paid me. You brought 2 literal chests of solid gold to my clinic." Draven leaned closer, his broad chest pressing against me. The carriage swayed as it navigated the cobblestone streets of the capital, but in his arms, I didn't move an inch. He was an immovable force of nature. "That was for my room and board," Draven corrected smoothly, his crimson eyes dropping momentarily to my lips before locking back onto my eyes. "Today, I protected you in the Great Hall. I stood between you and the Imperial Guards. I publicly defied the Crown Prince for you. I expect adequate compensation for my exclusive services as your personal bodyguard." My face flushed so hard I was genuinely surprised the velvet curtains of the carriage didn't catch fire. My modern, pragmatic brain scrambled for a logical response, desperately trying to ignore the intoxicating scent of sandalwood, leather, and rain that clung to his skin. I can give you a 20% discount on your medical bills," I stammered, placing my hands flat against his cold chest plate, attempting to lean back. It was completely useless. His hand, resting firmly on the small of my back, held me intimately in place. "Or maybe free ear scratches for a month?" "I do not want a discount, Julian," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that made my toes curl inside my boots. "I want my doctor." Before I could offer another terrible business proposition or formulate a coherent thought, he closed the remaining distance between us. His lips pressed against mine, completely silencing whatever nervous babble I had prepared. It wasn't the tentative, careful, overly sweet kiss of a standard romance novel protagonist. It was demanding, fiercely possessive, and incredibly thorough. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving in the dark for a lifetime and was finally desperately pulling himself toward the light. My brain entirely short-circuited. All my modern logic, all my careful plans to stay emotionally detached, and all my firm resolutions to just enjoy a quiet, solitary early retirement vanished into thin air. I made a soft, incredibly embarrassing sound in the back of my throat. My hands, which had been pushing against his armor, instinctively curled, my fingers reaching up to grip the heavy, dark metal of his shoulder guards. The cold, rigid steel of his armor was a staggering contrast to the burning heat of his mouth. I kissed him back. I poured every ounce of the exhaustion, the relief, and the strange, undeniable affection I had harbored for the giant shadow panther right back into the demon of the north. When he finally, reluctantly pulled back to let us breathe, my chest was heaving. We were both panting softly in the quiet confines of the moving carriage. Draven rested his forehead against mine, his large, callous thumb reaching up to gently trace the curve of my swollen lower lip. "You did not push me away," he observed quietly, a faint, deeply victorious smirk playing on his sharp lips. "You're wearing full Imperial battle armor," I gasped, trying and completely failing to reclaim some tiny shred of my professional dignity. "I'm a surgeon. My hands are my livelihood. I didn't want to break my knuckles trying to punch through solid steel." Draven chuckled. It was a deep, warm, rumbling sound that vibrated against my chest and made my heart skip a painful beat. "Liar," he whispered, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the corner of my mouth. "You are entirely mine now. Do not even think about running." I closed my eyes, leaning heavily into his warmth, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath the armor. Run. Who in their right mind was going to run from a fiercely protective, insanely handsome billionaire warlord who actively encouraged my career goals and threatened my toxic family with a broadsword? I was a traumatized millennial, not an idiot. The journey back to the Blackwood Mountain Sanctuary felt significantly shorter, mostly because I spent the entire ride securely wrapped in the general's cloak, comfortably dozing against his chest. When we finally arrived, the heavy wooden gates opened to welcome us home. The air was crisp, clean, and entirely devoid of the toxic, suffocating politics of the capital. Tofu the snow fox greeted us with a happy chirp, immediately leaping from a fence post onto my shoulder, completely ignoring Draven's low, warning grumble. "All right, everyone," I announced to the empty courtyard, clapping my hands together as Draven stepped down from the carriage behind me. "The drama is officially over. We have royal funding, we have zero family obligations, and we have a lot of work to do." And work we did. Over the next 6 months, the Blackwood Mountain Sanctuary transformed from a modest, rebuilt estate into a sprawling, state-of-the-art medical complex. With the Emperor's limitless funding, I didn't hold back. I hired the best architects in the region. We built pristine, whitewashed quarantine wards, specialized stables with heated floors for the winter, and a dedicated, sterilized surgical suite that rivaled modern operating rooms in efficiency, if not in electricity. I took on 3 bright, eager apprentices from Oakhaven, personally training them in anatomy, herbal pharmacology, and the strict importance of washing their damn hands before touching an open wound. As for my toxic family, the news from the capital was glorious. Duke Thorne, stripped of his wealth, titles, and prestige, had faded into miserable obscurity. His two-faced wife had quickly abandoned him the moment the gold dried up. Kale, after serving his time in the Imperial dungeons, was officially blacklisted from high society. The last rumor I heard was that the former angel of the capital was now sweeping floors in a lower-tier tea house, still trying to squeeze out a few pathetic tears for extra tips, though no one believed his act anymore. I was living the absolute dream. I had wealth, absolute respect, and a job I genuinely loved that didn't require me to sacrifice my soul to a hospital administration board. And of course, I had the Empire's most lethal warlord acting as my permanent receptionist. It was a brisk, sunny afternoon. I was in the newly built apothecary, carefully measuring out a dose of potent herbal painkillers for an elderly donkey with severe arthritis. The scent of dried mint and lavender filled the warm room. Suddenly, I felt a familiar, heavy presence step up right behind me. 2 strong, muscular arms wrapped securely around my waist, pulling my back flush against a solid, very warm chest. A sharp chin rested heavily on my shoulder. "You have been working in this room for 4 consecutive hours," Draven complained. His voice was a low, rumble purr right against my ear that sent a shiver down my spine. The ledger is balanced. The apprentices are handling the feeding. The shadow guards are patrolling the perimeter. Come take a nap with me. I rolled my eyes, though I couldn't stop the fond smile spreading across my face as I leaned back into his embrace. I am a dedicated medical professional, General, I said, playfully tapping my wooden spoon against the edge of the mortar. I can't just drop everything I'm doing because my giant guard cat is feeling clingy. Draven tightened his grip around my waist, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the sensitive skin just beneath my jawline. I am your partner, he corrected smoothly, his hands sliding down to rest over my hips. It is your legal medical duty to attend to my emotional well-being. I am suffering from severe neglect, Dr. Thorne. I laughed out loud, turning around in his arms to loosely wrap my hands around his thick neck. You are the demon of the North. You are a terror to the entire continent. You don't have emotional needs, Draven. You have violent territorial instincts. He looked down at me. The crimson eyes that struck fear into the hearts of thousands were utterly soft, filled with an overwhelming, absolute devotion that still took my breath away every time I saw it. Only when it comes to you, he murmured softly. He leaned down and kissed me again, slow, deep, and unhurried, right there in the middle of the apothecary, surrounded by the earthy scent of medicinal herbs and warm sunlight streaming through the windows. Outside, I could hear a rescue dog barking happily in the courtyard, the faint, cheerful chatter of my apprentices learning their trade, and the rustling of the ancient pine trees in the wind. I smiled against his lips, wrapping my arms tighter around his broad shoulders, pulling him closer. I had died of exhaustion in a cold, sterile, neon-lit clinic, dreaming of a life where I could just rest. I thought my story was over. But somehow, through the chaotic plot of a trashy romance novel, a dramatic stepbrother, and dragging one giant, terrifying, bleeding shadow panther out of the woods, I had found exactly what I was looking for. End of Part 7. Part 8. Winter descended upon the Blackwood Mountain Sanctuary not with a brutal freeze, but with a quiet, breathtaking blanket of pristine white snow. The estate was unrecognizable from the rotting, weed-infested ruin I had first been exiled to. Now, warm yellow light spilled from the glass windows of the newly constructed medical wings. The heated stables kept the recovering livestock perfectly comfortable, and the stone courtyard was swept clean. It was a quiet Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my heavy oak desk in the study, meticulously updating the medical charts for a flock of migratory birds we had treated the day before. The fire roared cheerfully in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. Draven was sitting in the armchair opposite me, dressed in simple, dark winter robes instead of his heavy armor, casually reading a military dispatch from the northern border. It was a picture of absolute, undisturbed domestic peace, which meant, naturally, the universe was about to throw a wrench into it. The heavy iron knocker on the front gates slammed violently, the sound echoing through the quiet, snowy mountain. Loud, panicked shouting followed immediately. I didn't even need to look up. Draven was already on his feet, his casual demeanor vanishing instantly as the lethal aura of the demon general snapped into place. I grabbed my emergency medical satchel, which I now kept fully stocked and resting by the door at all times, and threw a heavy fur-lined cloak over my shoulders. We rushed out into the freezing courtyard just as my apprentices managed to heave the heavy wooden gates open. A group of 6 massive, battle-scarred northern mercenaries stumbled into the sanctuary. They were covered in snow and blood, but it wasn't their own. They were carrying a massive, hastily constructed wooden sled. And lying on that sled was one of the most magnificent, heartbreaking sights I had ever seen. It was a glacial stag, a massive, mythical beast of the deep north. Its fur was the color of crushed diamonds, and its enormous antlers looked like they were carved from solid ice. But the majestic creature was thrashing in absolute agony. A broken, jagged hunter's spear was protruding entirely through its lower abdomen, and judging by the massive, swollen shape of its belly, the creature was heavily pregnant. "Help!" the mercenary captain roared, his breath puffing in white clouds in the freezing air. Poachers drove her into a ravine. We found her bleeding out. The local villagers said there was a divine healer on this mountain. I didn't ask questions. My brain instantly shifted into overdrive. "Bring her into the primary surgical suite. Now!" I barked, my voice cutting through the panic with absolute, uncompromising authority. "Apprentices, I need boiling water, a full set of sterilized heavy retractors, and 50 units of hemostatic herbs immediately. Move." The mercenaries hauled the sled into the brightly lit, pristine surgical room. They backed away, panting, looking entirely out of their depth. I threw off my cloak, scrubbed my hands with harsh alcohol, and approached the thrashing stag. Her eyes were rolling back, her breathing shallow and rapid. Tachycardia, massive blood loss, fetal distress. If I tried to pull the spear out now, she would bleed to death in seconds, and the calf inside her would suffocate. Hold her down, I ordered, looking over my shoulder at the mercenaries. The hardened warriors hesitated, intimidated by the sheer size and magical aura of the frantic beast. Get out of his way, a low, thunderous voice commanded. General Draven stepped up to the surgical table. He didn't wear an apron, and he didn't care about the blood. He simply placed his massive, calloused hands on the stag's broad shoulders and applied a steady, immovable pressure. His crimson eyes met the panicked, wild eyes of the beast. He didn't project killing intent. Instead, he projected a heavy, overwhelming wave of pure, grounding authority. Miraculously, beneath the general's hands, the massive glacial stag stopped thrashing. She let out a long, trembling breath and lay still, trusting the undeniable power holding her. Scalpel, I said, holding out my hand. My oldest apprentice slapped the sterilized blade into my palm. I went to work. There was no hesitation, no fear. The muscle memory of 1,000 modern trauma surgeries guided my every move. I made a precise, clean incision along the abdomen, carefully avoiding the major arteries surrounding the spear. Forceps, I demanded. For the next 2 hours, the surgical suite was a silent, intense battlefield. I carefully extracted the splintered spear, instantly clamping the ruptured blood vessels to stop the hemorrhaging. But the trauma to the mother's body was too severe. She was fading fast, her pulse growing dangerously thready. I have to perform an emergency extraction, I muttered, sweat beading on my forehead despite the winter chill. The mother is in shock. If I don't get the calf out right now, we lose them both. I worked with a speed that defied ancient medicine. I breached the uterine wall, my hands slipping through the blood and amniotic fluid until I felt the delicate, freezing touch of the unborn calf. With a grunt of effort, I gently pulled the baby glacial stag into the blinding light of the surgical room. It was not breathing. A collective gasp echoed from the mercenaries and my apprentices. I didn't panic. I quickly cleared the calf's airways with a clean cloth, grabbed a vial of concentrated, highly potent respiratory stimulant herbs, and rubbed it aggressively onto the calf's gums. Then, placing my hands flat against its tiny, fragile chest, I began to perform rhythmic, perfectly timed compressions. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Come on, I whispered fiercely, pressing down. You didn't survive a spear just to give up now. Come on. 1, 2, 3, breathe. For 30 agonizing seconds, the room was dead silent save for my heavy breathing. And then, the tiny calf suddenly jerked. It let out a high-pitched, surprisingly loud sneeze, shaking its small, icy head, and took a massive, gasping breath of air. The entire room erupted into cheers. My apprentices were weeping openly. The hardened northern mercenaries were laughing in disbelief, clapping each other on the back. I let out a massive breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my shoulders slumping in pure relief as I handed the squirming, healthy calf to my apprentice to clean. I quickly turned my attention back to the mother, rapidly stitching the internal uterine wall and closing the abdominal incision with flawless, rapid sutures. When the final knot was tied, I stepped back from the table. I was covered in blood, amniotic fluid, and sweat. I was entirely exhausted, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. A clean, warm towel was gently pressed against my forehead. I looked up. Draven was standing right beside me. He took the towel and methodically, tenderly wiped the sweat and blood from my face. He didn't care that there were 6 mercenaries and 3 apprentices watching us. He looked at me with an expression of such profound, staggering awe and absolute pride that it made my breath hitch. Flawless, he murmured, his deep voice carrying only for me to hear. You are magnificent, Julian. The mercenary captain stepped forward, ripping off his heavy fur hat and bowing so deeply his nose almost touched the floor. Divine healer, the captain said, his voice thick with reverence. We have never witnessed such a miracle. You pulled life straight from the jaws of death. Name your price. We will pay whatever you ask. Before I could politely decline, saving a pregnant animal was a reward in itself. Draven turned his head. His crimson eyes locked onto the captain. He requires no payment from you, Draven stated, his voice returning to its usual, terrifyingly cold command. He reached into his robes and tossed a heavy pouch of solid gold ingots directly at the captain's chest. The captain caught it, his eyes widening at the immense weight. You brought the beast here instead of letting it die, Draven continued. That is your reward. Now leave. My partner requires rest. The mercenaries didn't need to be told twice. Realizing exactly who was standing in front of them, they bowed frantically, practically stumbling over each other to exit the surgical suite, leaving the mother stag and her calf safely in my care. Hours later, the sanctuary was finally quiet. The mother stag was resting comfortably on a bed of fresh, warm hay, her calf curled up securely against her side, nursing happily. I had finally scrubbed the blood from my hands, taken a hot bath, and changed into soft, clean sleeping robes. I walked out onto the wooden veranda, holding a cup of steaming spiced wine. The snow was falling heavily now, coating the dark pine trees in a brilliant, glittering white. I leaned against the wooden railing, taking a slow sip of the wine, letting the quiet peace of the mountain wash over me. Suddenly, the heavy fur cloak was draped over my shoulders from behind. Draven wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling my back flush against his broad, incredibly warm chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, letting out a long, contented sigh as we watched the snow fall together. "You shouldn't be out here in the cold," he murmured, though he made absolutely no effort to pull me back inside. "I was just thinking," I said softly, leaning my head back against his shoulder, "about my past life. Before I ended up here." I felt Draven tense slightly beneath me, a subtle wave of possessive anxiety rolling off his frame. He tightened his grip around my waist. "Do you miss it?" I laughed softly, turning my head to press a gentle kiss to his jaw. God, no. I was miserable. I was surrounded by people, but I was entirely alone. I lived my life in sterile white rooms, running on coffee and stress, trying to save people until my own heart just gave out. I looked out at the massive, beautiful estate we had built together. "I thought my life was over," I whispered. "But coming here, being exiled, finding you bleeding in the mud, it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I finally have a home." Draven was quiet for a long moment. Then, he reached into the pocket of his dark robes. He gently took my left hand, his calloused fingers brushing against my skin. "In the north," Draven said, his voice unusually thick with emotion, dropping into a low, rumbling timbre that vibrated right through my soul. "We do not exchange delicate gold rings or fragile jewels to symbolize a union. Gold bends under pressure. Jewels shatter when struck." He slid something heavy, cold, and incredibly solid onto my ring finger. I looked down. It was a thick, meticulously forged band made of dark, matte black battle steel, the exact same indestructible metal as his imperial armor. Inlaid into the center of the dark steel was a single, flawless, deep crimson stone that perfectly matched the color of his eyes. "We forge bands of battle steel," Draven continued softly, his lips pressing against the shell of my ear, "because our vows are indestructible. They survive the harshest winters and the bloodiest wars." He turned me around in his arms, forcing me to look up into his striking face. The demon of the north, the man who brought entire nations to their knees, was looking at me with absolute, undeniable vulnerability. "I sent a raven to the Emperor this morning," Draven confessed quietly. "I officially resigned my position as the Supreme Commander of the Capital Vanguard. I transferred my military command entirely to the northern border, just 5 miles from this mountain. I am never returning to the capital, Julian. I belong here. With you. If you will have me." My breath hitched. My eyes burned, a sudden rush of overwhelming emotion making my vision blur. He was giving up the center of his political power, the absolute peak of his military career, just to ensure he could wake up in this sanctuary, with me, every single morning for the rest of his life. I looked down at the heavy black steel ring on my finger, then back up at the terrifying, majestic, fiercely devoted man holding me. "You're a menace, General," I whispered, a tear slipping down my cheek as I smiled brilliantly up at him. "You bullied my patience, you intimidated the royal court, and you're ridiculously possessive." Draven's expression fell slightly, a flicker of genuine panic in his eyes. I wrapped my arms tightly around his neck, pulling him down to my level. "But," I added, my voice cracking with pure joy, "you're exactly the kind of giant, terrifying guard cat I want to keep for the rest of my life." Draven let out a sound that was half laugh, half relieved sigh. He crushed his mouth against mine, lifting me entirely off the ground as he kissed me under the falling snow. It was a kiss that tasted like spiced wine, winter air, and absolute, unbreakable forever. I had been a burnt-out, exhausted surgeon who died alone. Now I was the most celebrated healer in the Empire, standing in the home I built, held in the arms of a warlord who loved me more than his own life. It wasn't just early retirement. It was paradise. End of story. Wow, what an absolute journey. If your heart isn't racing after that ending, you might need Dr. Julian to check your pulse. Welcome to the post-story breakdown, guys. Let's take a moment to unpack everything that made Julian and Draven's story so incredibly satisfying. First of all, we have to talk about Julian's approach to the transmigration trope. Usually, when a character wakes up in the body of an exiled, despised noble, we get chapters of them crying, wallowing in despair, or desperately trying to win back the affection of a toxic family. Not Julian. As a burnt-out modern surgeon, he looked at a brutal banishment to a ruined mountain estate and said, "Free real estate and early retirement? Yes, please." His absolute refusal to engage in petty family drama is what makes him such a refreshing and badass protagonist. He didn't wait for a savior. He set his boundaries, picked up a rusted sickle, and built his own empire from the dirt up. And speaking of family drama, how incredibly satisfying was that face-slapping scene in the Imperial throne room. Kale is the ultimate green tea villain, manipulative, entirely self-centered, and hiding behind fake tears and a fragile, angelic persona. But his downfall wasn't brought about by complex political scheming, assassinations, or dark magic. It was pure, unadulterated medical logic. The sheer vanity and stupidity of starving a snow fox and feeding a hunting falcon sugary pastries just to fit an aesthetic was the perfect, undeniable way to expose his fake kindness. Julian completely dismantled his stepbrother's entire life with nothing but science, a rubber tube, and cold, hard facts. Then we have the romance. General Draven is the literal demon of the North, a blood-soaked warlord who makes entire armies tremble. But the contrast between his terrifying public persona and how he acts with Julian is absolute top-tier BL romance. To the Empire, he is a lethal weapon. To Julian, he is a fiercely protective, incredibly jealous, overgrown guard cat who genuinely purrs for ear scratches. But what makes their relationship so incredibly solid is the mutual respect. Draven doesn't force Julian to give up his clinic or move to the capital. Instead, he gives up his own military command to protect Julian's sanctuary. That final proposal with the indestructible black battlesteel ring instead of fragile gold? Absolute perfection. It symbolizes that their bond isn't just for show. It's built to survive the harshest winters and the bloodiest wars. In the end, this story is about finding your own peace. Julian healed the broken, Draven protected the healer, and together, they built a sanctuary where two exhausted souls could finally rest. What was your favorite moment from the story? Did you love the throne room takedown, the surgery on the glacial stag, or the sweet domestic moments between Julian and his giant shadow panther? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for tuning in to your BL boyfriend. If you enjoyed this epic story and analysis, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next adventure. Stay safe, stay romantic, and I'll see you in the next video.